All right. What's going on, everybody? This is Chris from AppSumo with the Remote Work Academy, and I am super excited to have everybody coming in today. Nice Monday to start off the week, and we're going to be talking about something that can be very helpful if you are working in or running a remote team. And I am using this pretty selfishly because this is something I could use some help with. How to run effective one-on-one meetings and how to stay in sync with your team while you're working remotely. I actually have a one-on-one later today. Shout out to Bronte. So maybe I'll be able to use some of these strategies to make it as effective as possible.
Please
But
do.
before we get going, let me know in the chat where you guys are tuning in from. I am in Austin, Texas right now. Brennan, you're in Toronto?
Toronto, Canada. Yep.
Heck yeah. Awesome. Where is everyone else tuning in from? And also, are you guys a part of a team? Are you freelancers? Are you working remotely? What's kind of your setup look like so we can make this conversation as beneficial as possible? Like, who are you having one-on-one meetings with or remote meetings with? Is it with an internal team? Is it with an external team? For me, it's actually a combination of both. We have some internal teams that we work with as well as some external teams that we kind of have to stay in touch with. And so let's see what people are throwing up. So part of a team, partly remote. We got some folks from San Jose. We got some Toronto. Let's see, Jason is working remote since March 12th, having meetings with the boss. Okay, we want to make sure those meetings are as effective as possible. Let's get you that remote work promotion. We will be remote work post-pandemic. All right. We got Charlotte, North Carolina. I want to use it for meetings with external people. Okay. Cool. Meeting a lot of people remotely since pandemic. All right. Awesome. Well, before we dive in, let me guys give you guys a background on Brennan. So Brennan is the co-founder and CEO of Soapbox, the first app built for managers. Soapbox is a simple and powerful tool that enables managers to be great leaders through their one-on-ones in team meetings. They help managers make meetings more productive, collaborative, and organized, which is something that I think we would all benefit greatly from. And John, to answer your question, yes, this is being recorded and we'll send it out later. So don't feel like you got to take notes or anything like that. You absolutely can, but we'll make sure to keep you caught up. But Brennan, thank you for joining us this morning after that long introduction.
I loved it. Thanks for having me, guys. It's been awesome and really excited to hear and see folks tune in from all over the world. It's really cool.
Super cool. So have you been working remotely for how long? Like what's your background that led up to Soapbox? What's kind of your journey been like as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I'll start maybe like well before that, and then I'll kind of phase into the remote part of the question.
Cool.
I've been at it as it's kind of crazy to think about it this way, but as like a venture-backed CEO for about 10 years now.
Oh, wow.
It all started when I was actually a student in university, and I had feedback to share with my school. Had no idea what to do with that feedback, where to share it, all that stuff, but I ended up having a real life meeting, not remote, with the president of my school. And I said, wouldn't it be great if instead of every student walking into your office and sharing ideas like this, we just made an app? And he said, yeah, I want this app. So can you build it? And I said yes. At the time, I didn't know how to, but like learned how to develop and, started building it out and met a co-founder and, grew the business from there, eventually got VC funding. And we had a lot of, just by nature of like where we worked within the city, like, executives would kind of like come by the school and they'd poke their heads into where we were working and we'd give demos. And a couple of times they said, can I use this with my employees? So we said, sure. And so kind of fast forward 10 years later, we've been really working on how do we make employee feedback happen better, faster, stronger within organizations around the world, and been fortunate to work with large company-wide deployments at places like Walmart, Coke, Pepsi, kind of you name it, all the way down to, 2-person companies, 3-person companies, some of the fastest growing startups, to some of the highest tech companies like Netflix and Amazon. All with the same idea of how do we make feedback flow better at organizations. And one of the things we've learned is, as much as we would like feedback to flow org-wide, at the same pace, at super fast speed, the critical part in the chain is you and your direct manager. So if feedback's not flowing up and down at that one kind of micro unit, then it's just not working. So we zoomed in with our product to just really nail one-on-one meetings, and then I would say next team meetings. And if we can do a good job of that, the rest kind of just happens because it works up and down the org chart. To answer specifically on a remote, what I'll say is that the app works live in person, on mobile, over your phone, whatever. And we've had users across the globe use this in person to partially remote, partially distributed. To my surprise, there are so many more companies and organizations that are, more remote than you would think, right? We always joke a little bit internally. There's churches that have multiple different congregations around a small area, and the heads of those organizations meet on Zoom every week. They don't consider themselves remote, but they are, right? Restaurants with multiple locations in a way are distributed, and I never thought of those as remote organizations, but the managers have phone calls every week to sync up, and that's their team meeting. All the way to you have that. Small shop that all works in the same office and is trying to grow rapidly. And so then for us, we are in an office together normally, but we had been kind of transitioning to remote for the past little bit. So this kind of forced work from home scenario happened at a really weird time where we had been doing one work from home day for about 10 years. And then recently we added in a second work from home day. And that went well. We surveyed the team. We handled that really, really well. And then we added a third work from home day. And then so, when, the work from home orders came in from the government for us, it was kind of normal. We just flipped the switch. We told everyone, hey, just in case, the weekend before, we said, just in case, take your laptops home. You might not be back in Monday. And then we weren't. So really the only changes have been like, how do I do like a 30-person meeting? But otherwise everything else, we've kind of nailed it for the past couple of months for sure.
That's awesome. And you said downloads, if you don't mind me sharing, you said downloads for Soapbox are up like 3x over the past, I guess, couple weeks or so.
Yeah, probably more than that because we have our AppSumo freebie, which is still live. So
let me share that. If people want to check out, pick up Soapbox, it's available right. Oh, I just did it to all panelists. Let me do it to everyone. So you can, I guess you need to pick up a copy of this, but you guys can head over to AppSumo, and there is a free version of Soapbox available in the store right now that you can get your hands on, which is super cool. So get your hands on that, play around with it, check it out, and if you like it, please leave a review on the AppSumo page. It gives a lot of help, helps other people find these tools as well, which is super cool. But please continue.
But then outside of the AppSumos and the Sumo links, checking it out, we do have other channels that are going. And so if we kind of ignore the AppSumos, it looks like downloads are up or signups are up about 3x, and obviously more if you include the Sumo kind of rush that we've seen. So over 1,000 for the past couple of weeks, over 1,000 companies a week have been signing up. Inviting their teams, running meetings. And so obviously meetings are inherently like a multi-person thing. And so, it's been a pretty wild ride.
Well, there's two things that you said that I think are really interesting. One of them is, so remind me of Josh Waitzkin, the chess guy, where he talks about like, he basically teaches people the end game of chess first, where it's like you remove all of the other elements and you just start with like, what is the core fundamental unit that everything else like kind of like backs up or flows into. And so as opposed to thinking of like, how do we start with this massive organization and make sure information's flowing in all these different directions? It's like, well, what is the core of that? Where does that start? So to simplify down the problem that you're addressing and then being able to scale out from there, I think is a really, really interesting way that you guys went about it. And then the second piece, the idea that you said like information flowing both ways with a manager and like the person being managed. And I know Jocko talks about that in Extreme Ownership, where it's like you have to lead up and down the chain of command. It can't be this one-way street, because if it's like this authoritarian way where it's just like information is just flowing down, it's like you're not getting information from kind of like the bottom-up type method where people who have their kind of like hands in the dirt and are actually interacting with the reality of the business. It's like you can be missing a lot of that, which can then lead to a lot of mistakes. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, like, before we go into how to run these effective meetings, like what are some of the common mistakes besides those pieces that people run into that make their one-on-ones really ineffective?
Oh man, there's so much. I mean, we didn't we didn't just kind of fall upon this insight about one-on-ones. We fought our way here. We started with the org-wide, and we did 90,000 employee rollouts at Walmart, and really it was about getting the feedback up from the ground of the org chart, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
Often, I'm sure you're this, back when we could go to coffee shops, you'd be in a coffee shop and you'd hear, or a bar, right? And you'd hear the people beside you complaining about work, right? You hear so many things about, oh man, if they just did this, or they just did that, or blah, 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 blah. We thought, okay, what if we could surface some of those conversations to the leadership that could make a change? And what we learned, we gather all this feedback, compile it all in a way that they could read it. And what we learned, we give it to the executives, and the executives are like, you know what, this is great, but I can't action it. So the people who action it are, one level down. We talked to the VPs. The VPs would say, the people who really action it are the one level. We talked to directors, and the directors would say the managers. So we found there was this like really strange loop where like the feedback, it seemed like, with suggestion boxes, with our old tool, with, those pulse surveys, a whole bunch of things, engagement surveys you get, would kind of go to like HR, and they would go to executive, and then they would trickle down to your manager, right? We thought, man, that's like a really inefficient way to do it. It takes like 20 weeks for any feedback to actually get listened to. And if you're really pissed off, you're going to quit before that actually happens. So the feedback that gets implemented is for the people who've left. The average millennial, I think, leaves within 17 weeks of becoming disengaged. So what's the point of even doing it? So we said, well, if we really want our system to work, we have to at least get it done in less than 17 weeks. And the fastest theoretical way we could come up with was, what if each employee just told their boss? Like, what would happen if we just made this like obvious and simple? And so we experimented a little bit with it. We launched a Slack bot to manage your one-on-ones better. And if we could make it 10 times better, the managers would love it. And then, the rest would be easy. It turns out 70% of your company's employee engagement comes down to your relationship with your direct report, right? Mm-hmm. If it's good, if you have a good boss, great engagement. If it's bad, bad engagement. And the number one factor, the number 1 and 2, basically tied, is, do you regularly communicate with your direct reports or your team? And then do you regularly share feedback up and down, both ways, right? Mm. If you do those two things, you're it's 30 times more likely to be engaged each, right? So it's like 30 times more likely to have an engaged team if you regularly talk to your team, and 30 times more likely if you regularly share feedback. So you do those two things, that's it, right? That's like 99% of what you need to do. So I would say, we'll mix that with the fact that only 30% of workers in America are engaged. So the biggest thing that's happening right now is managers don't regularly talk to their team, and they don't regularly share feedback. So that's like the biggest thing, right? There's like some people who don't have one-on-ones with their boss, or, and I find this like funny, but they meet with their boss once a quarter, and that's like 4 times a year is not enough to be an effective manager. And unless they're like, really self-sufficient people. Mm-hmm. So those are like the first 2 things. But then I think when you go beyond that, like, how do you actually do a good job as a manager in some of these one-on-ones? I think it comes down to 3 core attributes in order to actually get feedback. And this works both ways, I'll say. But really, in a lot of ways, the manager has a little bit more power in the relationship. So you'd ideally like the manager to do this first. But the first 3 the first core things are psychological safety, benefit, and then effort. And so if you have all 3 of those things, you're basically golden. So what is psychological safety? It's, are you able to share your true thoughts without the fear of being ridiculed, basically? I kind of like the best analogy for that is like high school versus like kindergarten, right? In kindergarten, you can be as weird as you want to be, and everyone is very accepting of you, right? You can go around and talk about how you ate a bug or a rock, and everyone's like, that's cool. I, visited my grandma this weekend, and like no one bats an eye. In high school, everyone wears exactly the same clothes. They like exactly the same bands, and they're very afraid to kind of step outside of that, out of their cliques or out of their ways of doing things. And that, it really is about psychological safety. If on your team, there's people who are scared of kind of going against the norm or going against the flow, that's likely a sign of low psychological safety, and very, very low usually with, early workers, university grads, or something like that. And that's not a good thing. You don't want that. You want people to share their voice. And a good test in a meeting is if everyone in your team meeting is sharing thoughts equally, right? Like if everyone has about the same amount of minutes spoken at the end of a meeting, that's a pretty good sign. So you want psychological safety to be really, really high. Actually, Google found that one factor was the most correlated to productivity on a team within their own internal studies. The second thing is benefit. So say you're sharing something with your boss, and your boss makes it it's okay to share things. You're not going to get ridiculed for it, right? Like, but you share something with your boss, or someone shares something with you, and nothing happens, right? They share you that they share feedback and nothing happens. If Brennan, you show up for meetings 15 minutes late every single day, it's driving me nuts. And you go, okay, cool, thank you for sharing that feedback. I really appreciate it. And then you show up 15 minutes late, for the next month. You're going to stop getting feedback, right? And so the benefit has to be high. And even if you don't agree with it, step one is just to acknowledge it and say what you're going to do, right? Just commit to doing something, even if it's just, hey, let me think about this for the next week and I'll get back to you, because I might disagree, but I just want to, play this feedback as I go through my day to day. And then I'll, agree or disagree later on. If you're in a coffee shop or in like a bar and you hear people complaining like, I told my boss this, but they don't listen. What's the point? They'll stop sharing, right? You hear this all the time in those situations. Someone will say, did you share that with your boss, or you share that with your coworker? What's the point? They don't listen anyways. So that's benefit. You want benefit to be high as well. And then there's effort. You want effort to be low. So, if you're a person who prides themselves in being the devil's advocate, or prides themselves in being the one to kind of challenge, that's a really good role on a team. But you also have to challenge up into a line. You don't want to cross that line every single time, because people sometimes just get tired, right? Like they're exhausted and they don't necessarily want to fight like a PhD dissertation every single time they want to share a piece of feedback with you, right? Brennan, you show up 15 minutes late. Oh yeah? When? What were the meetings? I just want to go back and, okay, what date was that? Was that a Monday? Was it? And like you go through and you have to bring a mountain of evidence to do it. People are it's easier to avoid it than to share it. So if you really nail those three things, personally to receiving feedback, like if you create a psychologically safe space or have one on your team, there's a benefit to sharing, and you're low effort. Those are the three core things that create an environment where feedback just, almost is supercharged. It flows really, really quickly.
That's awesome. Is there a way that as the somebody being managed that you can help instill those ideas? Like because somebody in here, Sarah, said like, I want to pitch this to my boss. How would you recommend I go about that? It's like, are there strategies if like you're the one that's on the receiving end, you're like, I have feedback I want to give. What can you do to help create that kind of psychological safety? Or is it really like they have to come to that on their own?
I think I really think it's a group thing, right? So obviously there are situations where someone has like the world's worst boss, and that world's worst boss enjoys being this horrible person, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I genuinely do believe most people go to work and they at least try to do a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a boss who's just bad because they haven't been trained, and they don't know how to be a good boss, and they're doing their best, but they're just like, wildly unequipped for their role. The average manager goes 10 years into people leadership before they get any sort of training, right? So if you think about this, like most people go to university or college or school and they get training for trades program, they get training for whatever role they're going to do, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever program. At some point, someone flips a switch and they become a people leader. So someone who used to be a developer, a programmer, computer scientist, now becomes a people leader with zero training. So for the most part, most managers are just ill-equipped for the role that they've been given, and they're going to do their best to do it, but they need feedback in order to do a better job. They have no idea if psychological safety is low. They have no idea if they're high effort. They have no idea if they're, low benefit, because they think in their head they have this own narrative for their life and they're the hero of their own story. So they're doing the best they can, right? So I think step one is like, you got to grab the reins. And often it's talked about with one-on-ones that the one-on-one meeting is not your manager's meeting, it is your meeting. So step one is like, grab that rein. And just, even if it's as simple as like, hey, I was reading an article or I was watching a webinar and I heard that, it's a best practice for the employee to run the one-on-one if you're not already running it. Bring that up and say, if it's okay, I'd love to really contribute more to our one-on-one, or even if you're not having one, suggest like, hey, I think we should have a one-on-one. And in that scenario, if you've grabbed the reins, you can bring certain things up. And what I would do is I would work on certain things in that order, depending on who that person is. If effort, right? If you're dealing with someone who's high effort and you don't want to fight the PhD dissertation every single time, I would deal with that first, right? High effort people usually are high benefit people. So if you can deal with the effort part, so that they realize like, oh, okay, I am arguing every single piece of feedback I get, then you're going to have a much easier time if you deal with that one first than if you deal with psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
The other big tip, if you're doing something like this and you really want to get into like a better cultural place at work, is start a workplace book club. Really, really low effort for one person to do, if you do want it to be good, is wrangle a couple of people together. You need like 3 or 4, and get a book that talks about this, whether it's like Radical Candor, whether it's high output management, whatever you think your boss would be into. Most books kind of cover these same points anyways. And then all you have to do is like get the book, agree on the book time in your calendar to discuss it as a group, and make sure your manager's there. And so in that discussion, you're kind of creating a temporary place that's psychologically safe to talk about these issues. And then you can bring it up to the group, right? If you're moderating this session of 5 people, hey, do we think we have psychological safety in our group, right? And if there's a long pause, you can say, I heard on a webinar that if there's a long pause after that question, we don't. So what are ways we can fix it, right? And then that at least gets the conversation going.
Yeah. And I love that too, because you're not like calling it out. You're kind of like doing this roundabout strategy where you're like able to bring it up as opposed to doing it in like an accusatory way. You can just be like, hey, let's have a conversation about like each of these points. The other thing that I really like is the idea of like, if you're not having one-on-ones or you feel like you're not having them as frequently as you'd like, if you're going to your manager and saying like, hey, I would like to have a one-on-one, or I would like to do it more, I think the idea of offering to be the one who leads it also makes it easier for them to say yes. Because if you're like, you don't have to prepare anything, like let's just take 15 minutes or 30 minutes on Mondays and we can go through this. I'll do all the prep work. It's just I have things that I would like to go over with you. And so instead of them feeling like, well, if we meet for 30 minutes, that means I need to spend 30 minutes beforehand reviewing your performance, and then I'm going to need to be able to figure out what are the action items I want you to take away from it, versus like if you flip that script, you make it as easy as possible, you make the effort as easy on their end, then it can kind of benefit you in the long run.
Absolutely. One of the things our app helps with is kind of the prep side of things. So often, sometimes people need an excuse for some of these things, right? And so if you want to use our app as an excuse, that's really easy to do. Hey, I found this app, going to set it up. It should make the prep part really easy. It should make the documentation part really, really easy. I'll grab the reins on it and just test it with you. And if you want to, continue using it, it's a 14-day trial. So have at it. The other piece in our app, talking about like shifting the kind of blame game away, is some of the harder conversations to have about, effort or benefit or safety or the various other things that come up. We actually have as conversation starters built into our app, right? Mm-hmm. So at any point in time, you can open up like our bank of battle tested questions and add a couple of them in, and they're borderline proven to have those really, really good meaty discussions in a one-on-one. So even the prep effort from your side of things can be really low. You can just open it up, click 2 or 3 of those a week and be done with it. And at least you're at least nudging yourself along some of these conversations. Same
so do you think the manager should be doing this, or the employee should be doing this?
Both. I mean, we have questions for the direct report to ask their manager built into our app. And then we have different questions for the manager to ask their direct report. So depending on who's got the reins, it's going to surface it in a way that we think is, respectful and polite, so that you're not being accusatory, right? If you're bringing this up to your manager, and the same with your manager, right? Like if you're bringing this to a direct report, they're not shaking in their boots having this conversation. It's kind of softly brought up or subtly brought up in various different ways. And then the neat thing for both sides within our app is we actually have a report that talks about how often is in these one-on-one meetings, how often are you actually covering things like motivation, or actually covering things like professional development and growth versus work, versus, just comms. And that provides a really authentic third-party view um, into the meeting. So you can just look at this graph and say, oh, it looks like we should be talking more about motivation, right? And you can kind of blame it all on Soapbox, like keep piling the blame on us. Looks like we should cover motivation. Here's, built-in articles and conversation starters about motivation. Which one of these do you think would lead to productive discussion next week, right? Click, cool. And then you don't have to be the weirdo who wants to talk about feelings at work. Soapbox can kind of bring that up, and then, there's no excuse for your manager not to talk about some of those things.
So would you say, if you're whether or not you're a manager or someone being managed, it's like, what are the takeaways for each of those groups? Should it just be like, whichever one you are, you can go get Soapbox and set it up. And if you're a manager, now you can run your one-on-ones like this. And if you're being managed, you can present this to your manager. Like, how would you recommend somebody go about this?
Yeah, it works either way. I mean, the most common case I would say is a manager finds us, because they're the ones Googling these things anyways, but they find us, and then they deploy it with one person on their team. It goes well, they deploy it to more people on their team, and then inherently it kind of spreads across the organization that way.
Yeah.
It's the most common pattern. The second most common pattern is like the type A, or the high growth individual on a particular team is like, our meetings are a mess. We're not following through with things we're talking about. No one's accountable. I think there's got to be something to help. And they find us and they bring it up. And so the way it happens, usually those people tend to want to grab the reins, at least on their one-on-ones. It's a very safe meeting to grab the reins on, because it is, your meeting with your boss. It's not like you're stepping on their toes in a team setting.
Yeah.
So they, sign up for it and can use it. The truth is, you can use it yourself without inviting your boss for like the first meeting, and just say, I prepared some notes, right, that I want to talk about. The cool thing about being remote is you can have it open on your screen, look at the camera, and then go through the things you want to talk about and check them off as you go, and you'll feel like you're, being more productive.
Yeah.
And then you can say, hey,
awesome.
This is a really neat tool. I just took notes. So to save you time, I can share these notes with you. And then they'll start getting kind of sucked into our onboarding process, and hopefully, hopefully they'll kind of take over. But I really do believe like the one-on-one meeting can be your meeting. And so if possible, I would just request, hey, can I take, at least for this one meeting, can I take, some of the effort for preparing it off your shoulders? And I think we can make it more productive.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's kind of like, it's also like a false dichotomy that you're either like a manager or somebody being managed. It's like a lot of people are kind of in the middle, where it's like, you're not the lowest person on the totem pole and you're not the CEO. So it's like, typically you are having conversations with people you manage, and then also your manager, your boss, or whoever it is. So being able to find something that effectively works for you and somebody you're managing, you can also then reverse it and use it with your boss and kind of do it up the chain. And now you're basically connecting all the layers of your organization, one like node in a network at a time.
That's the idea. I mean, the truth is, like, if you're an individual contributor and you think it would be helpful for you in your meetings, it should be 10 times more helpful for your boss, or 5 times, depending on how many direct reports they have, right? They're going to have more meetings than you. So it should be more helpful for them. And then all the way up. I mean, we have, the head of HR at Airbus using the same tool that we have, like an esports gaming company, and they both find it valuable. The calls with the CEO of 15-person company, or 15-person companies all the time, and I have calls with 100 or 1,500 people companies all the time. So the truth is, like, at a core, at the core node, it's 2 people talking, and doesn't matter if you're, 2 people talking at a small company or 2 people talking at a monster-sized company. You're dealing with just like the core problems of human communication and human feedback. And the truth of it is, none of us are born good at talking to each other and giving and receiving feedback. That's like the number one thing we have to learn and get good at.
And so how often is there like a method to figure out how often you should be meeting and for how long? Like, what do you recommend for that?
Yeah, we have stats on like what the industry is doing, and so I'm sure Hiba will dump a link in the chat there for it. But we have stats for how often different various industries are meeting and talking. What I would say is to start, especially if it's a new relationship or whatever, is meet more frequently and meet for longer than you think is necessary. It's very easy to pull that back, right?
Hmm.
So in an event like a new employee is joining the team or your team, or you've recently become the manager or boss, or you've just switched to a new company, I would try to meet weekly. I would push for more than 30 minutes, right? Because then you can drop it to 30 minutes a week. And then if that's still too much, you can drop it to every other week, right? It's
Hmm.
so easy to do those things. If you're meeting once a month for an hour, it's hard to meet, once a week for an hour. That's just like a hard thing to do. And what I'd say is, given the certain circumstance, everyone is finding themselves working from home a lot more. People are finding themselves lonely a lot more, right? Number one problem most remote employees face with is actually loneliness, right? So I would push for, hey, given the times, I would love to meet with you 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour a week, just to sync up, catch up, see what's going on. The truth is, your manager, or if you are a manager, is going through a particularly tough time, because managing remotely is very different than managing if you're in the same office as someone. You can't walk by a person's desk and see what they're working on, right? So having that additional time right now is super beneficial, and then you can kind of keep it or adjust it if it's too much for you or not enough. But the idea is, once you have that time, just batch all your requests in there. So if you're meeting an hour a week or 30 minutes a week, if something can wait to that meeting, throw it on that agenda, forget about it. When the time comes, it's like, oh yeah, I do have these 12 things I want to talk about. But instead of annoying you on Slack all day or an email all day, I'm just going to quickly go through. We'll get 25 decisions done real quick. It'll feel like the most productive meeting of your week, right? And your manager will love that.
Mm.
Or if you are a manager, wouldn't you love that? That's kind of the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great too. It's because, yeah, especially when you're working remotely and there's just like a million things that come up every day, and then feeling like you're constantly going back and forth and just like being hit with decisions that need to be made at like random times, as opposed to being like, hey, we have 30 minutes or 60 minutes blocked off every week. I know going into it that I'm going to need to make these decisions, or we're going to need to make these decisions. When you're priming your brain for that, as opposed to just like it being 4:30 when you're working on two other projects and you get pinged with like, hey, so should we do like the red or the blue? And you're like, I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah. Wouldn't it be
Yeah.
good to like prepare and like have some data, ahead of time to at least go,
Hmm.
you know what, I've been thinking about this for the past couple of days. I think we got to go with blue here on this one. So,
Hmm.
for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's awesome. If anybody has any questions for Brennan, please drop those in the Q&A box. I see a couple popping up now. So what should you consider in remote meetings that you might not necessarily think about in a face-to-face setting?
So I think there's a lot, like, the first, there's so many, so I'll try to keep it short. One is 80% of our communication is body, right? Is body language. So if you're used to, for the majority of your career, meeting people face to face, all of a sudden, like even now, I'm looking at you on a screen, right? And you're looking at me on a screen, but my eyes aren't pointed at the camera. So it looks like we're not making eye contact. It's really strange. So like there's tiny little things. One is like move your hands around and make sure like the camera is situated so you can do this hand talking, or like have the whiteboard in the background, right? So you can do all of that. The second thing is like, hopefully there's a little green dot above your, or beside your webcam. And if you look at that green dot, it's going to appear as though you're making eye contact. And that matters for people, right? A lot of people make it feel like that's a personal style of communication, right? So the difference between me looking at the camera now and like me looking here, it makes it look like I'm actually paying attention. Like it's like this one is like I could be doing email, but I'm really just looking at myself. And this one is like I'm actually paying attention to the conversation. Subtle thing, matters a lot over time, right?
Yeah.
One is you're a boss or an attendee to a meeting who's not paying attention, and one is you're like actively listening and paying attention.
And you can even like, you can just drag the thing, like drag the zoom so it's right under the camera,
Right under
because
it.
otherwise it can feel weird if you're just staring at a camera and not looking at the person. But if you set them so they're very close together, it kind of does double duty there.
That's exactly it, right? So that's one. I mean, the body language is one as well. The big caveat I'll add to this is I think a lot of folks, and I was talking about this late last week with actually chief of staff at Wikipedia. Um, a, a lot of folks are experiencing remote for the first time or work from home for the first time. I think that's great. And I think in a way, this is going to fast forward kind of this remote movement for a lot of folks. I think for many folks that have like a bad boss or a bad culture, this is like almost remote taking a step backwards, right? A lot of people are going to have a negative experience with remote working for the first time. And so I don't think that's a good thing. A big part of what we're managing through right now, or what we're dealing with, is remote. And another huge part of it is actually a pandemic, right? So as much as it's about managing remotely, managing distributed, managing work from home, managing through Zoom, another part of it is managing through like a worldwide pandemic and an economic crisis. And not a lot of people have done that. And certainly not a lot of people have done that who are alive today or who had access to Zoom today, right? So it's very much a unique situation to do. So one big thing I would think about in some of your one-on-ones going forward for the next little bit is really check in on the emotional state of individuals, right? Loneliness is one of the biggest issues going on, right? So for the first time, extroverts aren't getting their fix. And that's hard, right? Your introverts might be loving it, right? And the extroverts might be going through a really, really tough time. And sometimes it's hard to see those people go through a tough time because otherwise you've been used to them, getting hits of energy and boosts of productivity from other people they've been around. So I would check in on the emotional state of them. Their siblings, their parents, their brothers, sisters might have been laid off, right? Their significant others might have been laid off. They might be having a hard time getting their bills paid. It could be just an incredibly stressful period of time in their surrounding life. That should affect productivity. If you have all of that hitting you at once, it should affect productivity. The waiting in line at the grocery store is longer. So all of these things are happening. I would think about this a little bit as like, how do we want to work from home and remotely, but then also how do we want to work during a pandemic, and how do we want to take care of each other as colleagues and friends and fellow employees through a pandemic. And some of that might be, being a little bit more flexible on start times and end times, and when kids jump in the video call and stuff like that.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I think it can be challenging. I think people jump to the conclusion that other people are like them. And so, like you're saying, if you're an introvert and you're like enjoying being at home and having more time that is under your control, you can think everybody's like that. And if you only know somebody as the person that's in the office and is always productive, you're like, well, I'm sure they're 10 times as productive right now. But realizing that not everybody has the same kind of psychological template as you, and being able to be like, hey, who is probably having a challenging time? Or let me not even speculate. Let me just reach out and see how people are doing. And, that's how we've been trying to kind of start a lot of our meetings. It's just like a mental health check-in. Like, how's everybody doing? How's everybody's week going? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the blockers? Like, how can we, get these things out of the way? Not even out of the way, but like, how can we address these? Because that's kind of the, like the under the water type stuff that's going on, that's controlling all of the other pieces.
Exactly. And the one thing I'll say, especially for those who are leaders who are attending, maybe you've never brought that up, right? How are people doing? I think you've likely got a lot of ground to catch up on quickly around trust and that psychological safety. If the first two people say good, how are things going? Good. And everyone else says good. Like, okay, well, the odds are statistically not everyone's good here, right? The first way to build trust, I always think, is to be vulnerable first. So before tossing that question over to the other person or to the group, share it, right? What's going on in your life that is affecting you, is affecting your productivity, is hard. I mean, we were talking about, like, before this started, like, it's just hard to get groceries done, right? It's hard to get, like, even though it feels like we have more time, it's hard to do really, really simple things. And let alone there's people in your life that are, potentially, exposed or endangered or whatever. I think sharing some of that, making it okay to talk about it, and leading by example is really helpful.
And to add on to that is like asking open-ended questions that don't allow for just like I'm fine. How are you? It's like being like, hey, what are some of the biggest challenges you're facing right now? Because for me personally, it's like getting groceries has been really difficult, and trying to organize and separate like work and life has been really challenging for me. Like, what are some of the things that you're going through? And I think it can definitely feel weird and feel vulnerable and feel like potentially like too personal for work. But at the same time, this is something that we haven't gone through, and I think me and some friends were talking about this idea where like when you think, like, if 6 months ago someone said, hey, we're going to be living through a global pandemic, it's like, you don't think you're still going to be working if something like that's happening. And then the idea that it's like, oh yeah, like the world is going through this major crisis, and you still just like, if you're lucky enough to have a job, you still have a job to do, and you need to be able to balance those two things. And so being a bit more kind of flexible with like where you draw the line and where is that like emotional boundary with you and the people you work with, because there are people that are lonely and people that need support, and that might not be obvious when you're just hopping on a 15-minute Zoom call. So being the one taking that leadership role, regardless of if you're the one managing or being managed, it's like everybody can be a leader in their own way, and kind of stepping up and taking the reins, like you said, to like extend the first hand.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, we got a ton more questions to get through for you. Let's see. What's a question you love asking in one-on-ones?
It's funny. I used to have one. I used to say, scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you at work? And what I would, the question is stupid. It's really about them putting a number down, and then just like jotting a note of it. And the real discussion happens with what would take you from a 6. First of all, if they say anything like above 7, it's probably not a lot of psychological safety. But if they give you a 6, right, there should be like, just naturally as life goes on, there should be some weeks that are a 6, or like some months that are a 6, right? People go through tough times. So say they give you a 6. It doesn't matter if it's a 6. What matters is you asking the follow-up question, what would take you to a 6.5 or a 7, right? And the idea there is getting people to a 10 is almost impossible. And certainly there are some people who have just lived their whole life that 10 is an impossible thing always to hit, right? Everything can always get better. I can always do more. So sometimes the highest someone will ever give themselves is a 9, right? But knowing what would take you to a 6.5, you can probably do that this week, right? Even if it's to your manager or to a direct report, like knowing what would take someone from a 6.5 to a 7. Oh, if this was unblocked, if I could have this call and we maybe made a dent in this one project and whatever. It's like, okay, great. You know what I'm going to do? My discretionary effort is going to go in that direction just this week, right? And I'm going to show this person that, like, to help them out a little bit more at work, I'll do that. So it used to be that. Now what I do now that Soapbox has like some of these questions randomly in there, what I actually do is I show the insights graph to a direct report. And so if for the past couple of weeks we've been talking a lot about work or whatever, I'll say, hey, we haven't covered motivation in a little while. I want you to pick one of these, and we're going to talk about it the next week. And so every week we just pick a random question from Soapbox and have that conversation. And what's neat about that is it leads to surprising conversation. So if you always ask like your same favorite question over and over and over again, you start to like anticipate what their answers are going to be, which is good. That's a good thing. But to me, like I have more fun when I get something surprising out of it. And I really didn't expect to have that conversation, or really didn't expect to get that insight out of this conversation.
That's awesome. I think that's what this seems to be doing basically is like, I think there's this false idea that at work, it's just like leave your emotions at home, and then you come in and everything is logical and rational, and you can just like have these meetings that are very focused on like the facts and figures. And what this is doing is like, you can't do that. Like everybody runs based on emotions and what they're experiencing and what they're going through. And there's this Jonathan Haidt who wrote the happiness hypothesis. He talks about this idea of the rider and the elephant, and like the elephant is your emotions, and your kind of like rational, newer mind is the rider. And it's like the rider can kind of like subtly nudge the elephant, but for the most part, the emotions are steering the ship. And it's like the elephant wants to go one way, it like the rider cannot control that elephant. And so instead of trying to get rid of the emotions, it's like, how can we bring those up in a productive way? And so like having these questions that are built in, that are designed to kind of peel back those underlying layers, I think not only does it help with the motivation and the productivity because people feel listened to and feel heard, but it also like creates these elements where there's more trust and more understanding, and like you can build a deeper connection with the people that you're working with.
I think you have it exactly right. And it's funny because I feel like for a long period of time, the only emotion that was allowed at work was fired up, right? As long as we're fired up about our goals, we don't ask any questions, right? But there are negative emotions that can, really pull you away from being productive against those goals. And I think you mentioned it right away. Is not only is it emotions, is that everyone is different, right? So some people are incredibly motivated by money, and it's awesome. That's a really easy incentive to align. Some people are really motivated by the team around them. Some people are really motivated by their friends. Some people are really motivated by like a higher purpose and calling. And the truth is, if you have 5 people on your team, you're going to have 5 different people motivated by 5 different, formulas of a mixture of all of these things. And I think if you want to hit your goals, you're going to want to either, as a manager, tune those formulas so that people are fired up towards their goals in their own unique way. And if you're an employee, I think you owe it. You're doing your boss a great disservice if you're not sharing that information, right? Like, it would be weird to bring it up in this way, but if you were to say to your boss, like, hey, just so that you know, I am motivated by these 5 things weighted in this way. And if you want to get me to work incredibly hard forever, tweak these couple settings, and you'll never have to talk to me again. I'll be so happy and excited and productive. I'll be the best employee you've ever had. That'd be weird, and it'd be impossible for even you to know that about yourself. So just imagine how hard it is for your manager to guess at some of those things. So the more we kind of have those conversations, I think the better in general businesses can do.
And because I imagine like the opposite of that is probably what a lot of managers do, is it's like they kind of just apply like a blanket template of like, I am motivated by money, therefore everyone that works for me is motivated by money, or whatever it is. It's kind of the same idea with like the 5 love languages, where it's like everyone falls differently on like whether or not they like having quality time, or they like getting gifts, or they like physical touch, or whatever it is. And it's the same thing with work. It's like, just because you like one of these elements doesn't mean that that's the primary motivator for someone else. And then that goes to the psychological safety of this, where I think a lot of people, where you said like, the only emotion you can have at work is fired up. And it's, how do you create an environment where if somebody is like, they're feeling down, or they're feeling like they're not being listened to, or they're feeling like what they're working on isn't meaningful for them, or whatever it is, it's like, how do you create that environment where someone doesn't feel like they're just complaining, or they're looking like a bad employee, or they don't want their manager to think that they're not motivated? And so like, how do you develop those kinds of like, foster that type of environment where people can bring those things up without like feeling like it's going to negatively impact them?
I think part of it is being vulnerable. And first of all, I was going to make a comment. You're nailing the book references today. You're
Oh, thank you.
I have a bunch of groups that I participate in, a bunch of CEOs, and it's funny. The love language book is brought up all the time, and like folks going through whatever they're going through, and that book gets brought up not only obviously as a way to help the at-home part of life, but the 8 hours you spend with other people is just a really good example of how everyone is very, very different, and we don't take into consideration how different people are. We just apply our own selves onto other people. I think really the step is can you be, how comfortable are you in feeling vulnerable first, right? Are you, and it's scary, right? Are you, if you are feeling these things, and I think for a lot of, I'll say like a lot of men at work, even knowing what emotion you're going through is just an incredibly hard challenge. I have in one of these groups with a bunch of other CEOs, we're all dudes. We actually, for about a year, used a template that listed out different emotions. And anytime a guy said, good, we're like, nope, pick one. What do you, when you say good, do you mean happy, or do you mean elated? Do you mean joy? Do you mean like giddy? Like define good. Fired up? Like give us some color to it. Because good is really just like something that kicks the bucket down the road and tries to not talk about it. So if you're feeling good, what does that mean, right? Like, can you open up on it? Love languages is the book I think that you're referring to, but but I think step one is always be vulnerable first. So if you can start a meeting with what's happening in your personal life or something like that, and don't just share the good stuff. Share some of the bad stuff, right? For
Yeah.
myself, my grandmother's home that she's in, she's like Alzheimer's, just had their first COVID patient. So we're waiting to get my grandmother's results, right? That's pretty scary, right? I'm worried for her, and it's occupying parts of my brain. That was part of my weekend, right? Like, how's everyone else's weekend going? And that at least lets people go like, maybe I can share something here, right? And you push it. It's a muscle. You exercise it, and you get better at it. And that's how some of these things build, and you really develop care for one another. I think at work.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that about your grandmother. I hope it all works out well.
Yeah, crazy times.
Yeah. And to go on to what you were saying about like just saying good, I think the same, like a similar thing can happen with the negative emotions where you'll just feel, I forget where I read it, but the idea that like when you feel angry, anger is rarely the real emotion that you're feeling. It's like this secondary, tertiary emotion that you sit on top of the actual emotion that you're feeling.
How you
like
deal with it.
what? Yeah, it's like you think that you're angry or you think that you're frustrated, but it's like in reality, it's like you're not frustrated. You think you can't accomplish this task and you're not good enough, and you're worried you're gonna like lose your job or you're gonna screw something up. And same thing with anger. It's like anger is usually like sitting on top of fear or sadness, and so being able to strip away like, okay, that's level one. What's sitting underneath the anger in being vulnerable with yourself, and then being able to be vulnerable with the people you manage, and then they're going to be able to be more vulnerable with you. But if you're completely closed off, you're emotionally blocked, and then to kind of want that in response to have somebody open up to you, it's like that's not a game that you can win.
Well, even think about it like, so I can imagine there's some folks listening, watching, being like, this is some hippie stuff. And I was there too. I was 100% there too, right? I even told when I started talking about this with other CEOs, I'm going to meet with you guys like 3 times and then I'm out of here, unless it's really productive. But there is an incredibly, it's an incredibly productive thing to understand your own emotions, right? And I think certainly as I would say like stereotypical guys, like we're not trained, to be honest, like I didn't even have the vocabulary to assign an emotional state to myself. Like I literally didn't even know the words and how to map them to my feelings. And you get to a point where you are frustrated a lot or angry a lot. And that comes out as however that comes out with for you. But like think about how incredibly productive it is if you're at work and you find yourself angry and you go, you know what? I'm actually not angry at this person. I'm angry at this one project, right? I'm angry at this one piece of our system. What if I just, like, now that I've spent 5 seconds like understanding, I'm not angry, I'm just confused at the status and why it's taking so long. What if I just check in on that, right?
Yeah.
It's just so much more productive than going around stomping and yelling.
Yeah, being able to narrow down the scope of like
The
what's
skill.
actually causing you some type of like misalignment. Because I think it makes me think of when you're like integrating 2 softwares and it tells you to like say you're connecting your like landing page software to your email marketing, and you have to map the 2 where it's like this field of email matches this field of like email underscore whatever. But it's when you're dealing with the emotions and the rational side, it's like you don't know where the mapping goes. And so it's all just like every emotion maps to anger. And it's like, no, that's a very unsophisticated way to do it, but that's just the default because a lot of people don't learn this. And so being able to kind of separate that out and not everything filtering towards the same thing, I think is hugely important, and it benefits you kind of across the board in work and life and all of your relationships. And you're not fighting against yourself. Like you're integrating all of these pieces together so you can be more productive and have more energy, and your whole kind of system is in alignment, moving you towards one goal, as opposed to like having things that are pulling you in all of these different directions and just draining you.
Exactly. One other tiny little tip on this that I think is worth sharing, because it was a tough one for me and I didn't realize I was doing it, is when someone opens up, right? When someone is vulnerable to you, it's a very obviously vulnerable state that they're in, right? And so how you react to that is basically, they're only going to do that once, right? And if you screw that up, it's a closed door for a long period of time until you earn that trust back. So if you find yourself in that situation, you got to be careful with the next steps that you choose. And like, by no means is this like everything operates in slow motion. You might not even you might not even know if someone's being vulnerable with you, but they're testing as they go, as they open up. So there's a couple things I think that are worth always doing. When someone shares feedback with you, that's them being vulnerable. Also, when they're like letting you know their emotional state, that's them being vulnerable, right? Step one is just thank them, right? Like, hey, thank you for sharing that. Like, I understand that that's like a hard thing to do, and I really appreciate that you took the time and energy to share that with me. The second thing is just be cautious of using the word should, right? It's just like in public speaking where you're cautious of saying ums and ahs. Be wary of saying, oh, what you should do is call this person. What you should do is read this book. What you should do is now obviously when we're giving advice, that's 100% people are tuning in to ask to hear what we think they should do. But when someone is being vulnerable, they're not necessarily asking for advice. And a lot of times I think people get confused between the two, and they think it's someone asking for advice, and it might just be them sharing. So something I would say, like, just be cautious of is say should. Should is kind of in a weird way a judging word, right? Oh, you should do this. It's inherently stating where you're at is bad, right? And that you're not smart enough to realize to get out of the bad state. Here's the step, right? They might know all of this stuff, and so you're kind of judging them that they don't know it and that they're in a bad spot. So I think be wary of that. What you can do instead of offering advice when someone is in that state, share an experience that you've had that has helped you. And in that way, you're giving the advice, but not judging, right? So for example, if someone says they're struggling with a particular project, right? Instead of saying what you should do is, practice proper time management, show up to work at 9 and like get these, what you can say is like, oh, you know what? That really reminds me of a situation I was in a couple of years ago. I had this really important project I had to get done, and there was just no time to do it. One of the things I did that really helped me was I actually showed up like 15 minutes earlier, and I chose one big thing to do every single day, and I just made sure I got that done, right? And that really helped me kind of get through that time. I totally understand what you're in. It's super stressful. And let them pick up that advice if they want to hear it, right? Now, depending on like your relationship, sometimes you might need to be the task manager or someone, but anyway, so sometimes it's helpful just to share those experiences.
Awesome, man. This was incredible. I got a ton out of this personally, and I did not think we're coming up on time right now, but this was super cool. And I think let us know in the comments what you guys got out of this conversation with Brennan and how this is going to kind of change your one-on-ones. I think it is definitely going to for me. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and offer the insights that you have on all of this, because I think now is a very important time to kind of use this as a learning moment where you can start taking these things that, this moment is catalyzing people to action. And now is a time where you can change things. Let's see, somebody said, my biggest learning is if you want your team to be vulnerable first. Awesome. Said this was very inspirational. So Brennan, thank you so much. Once again, people can check out Soapbox on AppSumo, appsumo.com/soapbox. Play around with it for your next one-on-one. And let us know in the comments, leave a review. Let us see what you think, how you guys can use it, how you're using it, and how it's changing your one-on-ones. Brennan, do you have any last things to add before we sign off?
I have nothing but to say other than thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. There's a freebie going on, so make sure you grab that freebie. And if you didn't grab it, just message me in some social media site, and I'll figure out a way to get it to you. Otherwise, I think, take care, be safe, stay 6 feet apart, or as we say here in Toronto, one hockey stick.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brennan. This was great. Super valuable. So thank you for taking the time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.